Anyone looking into their French-Canadian roots will soon come across this term, fille du roi, or daughter of the king. Not to be taken in a literal sense, the filles du roi were a group of some 700 unmarried women who were sent to New France between 1663 and 1673 by King Louis XIV. He wanted to solve a gender imbalance problem and ultimately help to populate the new colony. The women were called Daughters of the King because the French state paid for their recruitment, clothing, and passage to the New World, and offered dowries to the women when they married. Sadly, their history isn't well known in Canada, or even in Quebec, where most French Canadians can trace their lineage to one or several filles du roi. For those only vaguely familiar with this group of women, it isn't surprising to hear them ask questions like, weren't they all prostitutes kicked out of France? This couldn't be farther from the truth. So where did this idea come from? The answer lies in the Salpêtrière in Paris. Originally a gunpowder facility, the building was converted into a hospice for destitute women in 1656 by Louis XIV. It was truly a wretched place. Dirty, cold, and overcrowded, the hospital was a dumping ground for women who were mentally ill, disabled, epileptic, poor, or orphaned. It was also where authorities sent prostitutes to keep them off the streets of Paris. The Salpêtrière soon became associated with prostitution, or the so-called filles de joie. When Louis XIV directed his advisor Jean-Baptiste Colbert to recruit women for the passage to Canada, the Salpêtrière in Paris was a natural option. The facility was overcrowded, and authorities were keen to offload some of its residents. We know that about 250 filles du roi came from the Salpêtrière. They were personally chosen by two women who came from New France for the recruitment, Madame Jeanne Bourdon, whose real name was Anne Gagné, and Mademoiselle Elisabeth Etienne. They were specifically looking for women who were young, average or good-looking, single, smart, strong, in good health, and having good morals. Each fille du roi also had to produce a certificate of good conduct signed by their priest or a judge from their hometown. Therefore, it is doubtful that any known prostitutes would have been selected to become a fille du roi, and historical records back this up. We do know that some of these prostitutes were sent to other French colonies like Louisiana and the Caribbean. Most filles du roi from La Salpêtrière, however, were there because they were orphaned or they were very poor. Of all the filles du roi, we know that about half were paternal orphans and about 20% were maternal orphans. Once they were selected by Gagné and Etienne, the young women were given the option of making the voyage to New France. Although it may have seemed like a daunting option, for most of the Salpêtrière recruits, it was worth the gamble to escape their current conditions, despite the hardships of the voyage, the harsh Canadian climate, and the threat of attacks from Indigenous tribes. How much of this they actually knew before accepting to leave France, we will probably never know. Whether they truly had a choice in the matter is another question mark. Although a good proportion of the filles du roi came from Paris, many also came from the region of Normandy and the western part of France, where the port of La Rochelle was. In fact, most of these women left France from either the port cities of La Rochelle or Dieppe. We know that a little over 60% of the women came from an urban setting, whereas about 28% came from a rural setting, the origins of the rest being unknown. Interestingly, most of the men they married in New France came from a rural setting. On average, a fille du roi leaving France was 24 years old. Before leaving France, each fille du roi received a trousseau, a kit containing a comb, a belt, a pair of shoes and shoelaces, a pair of pantyhose, a pair of gloves, a bonnet, 2 coiffes, which was a kind of hood, and sewing supplies, 100 needles, a case and thimble, thread, scissors, pins, 2 knives, and cloth. Once on the ship, the women could expect a rough voyage of at least 6 weeks with other passengers, crew, animals, water reserves, cannons, and hordes of various merchandise. Passengers slept in extremely cramped quarters in the ship's hold, and conditions were far from hygienic, especially when people were overcome with seasickness. almost 10% of passengers died on their way to Canada. If they were lucky enough to survive the passage to Quebec City, the welcome that awaited the passengers was raucous and festive. Civil and religious authorities were on hand, as were the local inhabitants and hopeful young bachelors. The Filles du Roi, who ranged in age from 16 to 40, were then sent to live with respectable families or in homes run by nuns. In fact, the term Filles du Roi has been attributed to Marguerite Bourgeois, the French nun and founder of the Congregation of Notre Dame in Montreal. In her writings from about 1698, she referred to the 17 marriageable women she was housing who were waiting to find a husband. These Filles du Roi were taught how to cook, clean, and sew, essentially, how to be a good wife and mother. Many women stayed in Quebec, but some made their way further down the St. Lawrence River to Trois-Rivières or Montreal. One advantage that the Filles du Roi had was a choice in who they married. In 17th century France, this certainly would not be the norm. Arranged marriages were. Given the gender imbalance in the colony, these young women could essentially choose their husbands, and they did, quickly. On average, a Filles du Roi married within 5 months of arriving in New France. The monetary incentive provided by the king was surely a motivation to marry, and there must have been considerable pressure by civil and religious authorities to start a family as soon as possible. To say that life was not easy for our founding mothers would be an understatement. The land they were given was most often wooded and needed clearing, and their home would have likely consisted of a ramshackle cabin. Winters would have been particularly dire, as most Canadians can imagine. But they made the most of their situation, and luckily for Louis XIV and Colbert, most Filles du Roi did become pregnant, had large families, and achieved their objective in growing the population of New France. On average, a Filles du Roi had 6.4 children and kept having children until the age of 40. With the Filles du Roi, another one of Louis XIV's objectives was also met. Given that many of them came from Paris, they were responsible for the proliferation and standardization of the French language, whereas most of the men who came before them spoke patois, or regional dialects. The Filles du Roi represent half of the women who immigrated to New France in the early days of the colony. Their place in our country's history is undeniable, even though they weren't the only French women to immigrate here. When most French Canadians can trace their heritage to at least one Filles du Roi, we can see why the term founding mothers is more than appropriate. Thanks for listening to our video on this amazing group of women. If you enjoyed our video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on French Canadian genealogy and history.